That's a story as old as time, is manipulating people not to form intra-class coalitions by playing up divisions, right? It could be divisions between Catholics and Protestants, whites and blacks, immigrants and native-born citizens, but that's always in the interest of the wealthy and the well-off to play up those differences, because otherwise you get a genuinely redistributive coalition that does the New Deal.
I studied this part of history at school in Italy. We don't call the American Revolution a revolution. We call the American War of Independence. And maybe it's because it resonates more with the Italian wars of independence. So my first question is, was it really a revolution? And if the answer is yes, maybe this counter-revolutionary coup was necessary, because if it is a revolution, it's the only revolution that doesn't end up in a lot of blood, because from the French Revolution to the Soviet to the Chinese, the result have been disasters. So was it a necessary counter-revolution or not?
Well, the revolution ends and Americans don't have any reason to bloody up each other. There was a lot of violence and confiscation against loyalists. Loyalists were the Americans who sided with the British, and there were a lot of them, but they mostly didn't need to kill them. They took away their property. You know, you didn't have a proletarian working class that was advocating redistribution. Most of the people who wanted debt relief were pretty conservative farmers who just didn't want to be taxed out of existence and didn't think they should be paying off this debt that had been scooped up by speculators. So, it's not a communist revolution against the elite. The United States never really had that, partly because Teddy Roosevelt understood that you needed some progressive reforms to prevent the country from moving to socialism, and his distant cousin Franklin Roosevelt understood that you needed a New Deal to prevent communism from taking over the country, right? There's been enough concessions so that you didn't have a revolution of the poor against the rich. And, the reason why I think most political scientists would say this is not controversial, the reason why you never had socialism genuinely prosper in the United States is because you had this big divide in the working class. And it wasn't just black against white, although that was the most salient divide. It was also Catholic against Protestant. So it's much easier to mobilize a poor working class in Great Britain, a homogeneous ideological unitary working class, because they didn't have the religious differences and they didn't have the racial differences. Was a counter-revolutionary coup necessary? I think now we're actually getting closer to the point that if we don't do something to make the plot of ordinary working people better, the country is falling apart at the seams. And I think that's going to require dramatic economic reform. And to get dramatic economic reform, you're going to need dramatic political reform. I think if the United States doesn't become more like Northern Europe, more like Norway and Sweden, where, you take care of ordinary working class people so they don't become fascistic, I think we're in a lot of trouble, and we're already pretty clearly in a lot of trouble. I mean, the damage that the Trump administration has done is enormous. I'm not sure all of it is remediable. I don't think you can fix NATO ever. I think the United States has given a tremendous leg up to China. I don't know why any other country would ever trust us in a trade agreement. I don't think you can undermine the brain drain that's going to go on because of the federal government's assault on science and universities. You know, I, we maybe will get one shot to do the dramatic things that are necessary, but if we don't provide, free childcare, free community college, universal health care, I think the country doesn't have a very bright future. Historically, maybe you didn't need to do those things, but the last 50 years has shown not only the most enormous wealth disparities in history, but also that the wealthy people seem pretty oblivious to the idea that ordinary working people are just not going to take their lives getting worse and worse without resorting to extreme measures, right? The extreme measure on the right is voting for Donald Trump, and the extreme measure on the left is, voting for some sort of socialist redistribution.
How much of an overstatement is it to say that you'd argue that all of American history has been the pursuit of somewhat narrow financial interests cloaked in grander aims?
The Revolutionary War, I think, is fairly seen as Americans not wanting to pay higher taxes and stating these grand principles, all men are created equal and we believe in human rights and so forth. But basically, Americans were being taxed heavily in the 1760s to repay Britain for the costs of the French and Indian War. And Americans don't ever want to pay taxes. And a lot of fight over the Constitution was the two sides saying, if you ratify the Constitution or if you don't ratify the Constitution, your tax is going to go up. Southern slave owners who are fighting to preserve the institution of slavery. Well, it's not all about a financial interest. Slavery is also a social system, but it's largely that slave owners were doing really great. The Northern perspective on the Civil War is a little more complicated because I think most Northerners were fighting to preserve a union. And I don't think that's simply a financial interest, but was it partly a financial interest? Sure. A lot of Northerners were very unhappy that slave owners were dominating the national government, and that was preventing them from imposing high tariffs, which of course are financial interests of Northern manufacturers. It was preventing them from, building internal improvements with federal money. And of course, that's something very greatly of interest to Northern commercial men. So yeah, I'm kind of a materialist at heart. I think it's a mistake to reduce everything to financial interest because it's pretty obvious that people can be deluded into voting against their financial interest, right? Why is the white working class now voting 2/3 for a Republican Party that quite clearly is not running the government in their financial interest? But who's driving the agenda of the Republican Party? It's the billionaires who have very clear financial interests in deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, and so forth. And it's not that hard to manipulate people, right? That's a story as old as time, is manipulating people not to form intra-class coalitions by playing up divisions, right? It could be divisions between Catholics and Protestants, whites and blacks, immigrants and native-born citizens, but that's always in the interest of the wealthy and the well-off to play up those differences, because otherwise you get a genuinely redistributive coalition that does the New Deal, right? And for 50 years, you get a dramatic contraction in wealth disparities, and you get the wealthiest, most prosperous middle class in history. And it takes the race issues of the 1960s to start to undo that coalition.